Hello. Hi. Okay, sorry I'm a little bit late. It's funny because I actually tutor students online and we always have tech issues. So now I'm like on the other end of like having a tech issue. Okay, so our topic for today is after death, there must be some form of life or consciousness. And so I'm just gonna start with giving a couple of definitions. So first of all, must, this is just the dictionary definition, expressing an opinion about something that is logically very likely or something that should not be overlooked or missed. Death, just kind of the regular like hospital definition of death, cessation of human body functions like heartbeat and breathing. Some form of life, characteristic that distinguishes entities that sustain biological processes from those that do not. And then consciousness, which I got this actually from a website and liked it. And we'll probably talk about this more too. The continuous river of ever reoccurring phenomena pinched like eddies into isolated minds. The river of collective consciousness links all beings who have ever existed, exist now, or will exist. And so basically my main contention here is that when a person's physical body dies, when their heart stops beating and their lungs stop breathing, it enters into a different relationship with the earth and all of its interconnected processes. My contention is that some physical forms of life that survive after a person physically dies, according to that definition, include the bacterial colony, which interacts with the bacterial colony of other beings, thus impacting the collective whole life of the ecosystem and therefore the planet. A person's children, who are made of living matter taken from her own body and can and will continue to survive after her death. And finally, written, visual, or recordable art created by that person as an expression of that person's consciousness. So basically, my whole main argument is one of that you and I are as much continuous with the physical universe as a wave is continuous with the ocean. And this idea that life transforms rather than being completely stopped. And so the resolution itself does say some form of life. And I know that a couple of the previous debates that I've watched have talked a lot about like a deistic type of view, like a religious type of view. And that's not the view that I'm taking here. It's these kind of specific measurable things that are indeed some form of provable life or consciousness after death. So that was really all I planned on saying at the first part. I think I talked really fast because I still have a couple of seconds left. So I'll just turn it over to you.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to talk about a couple of things that you started talking about as well. So your really main point here was that life can be transformed and you can leave other things behind, and that's an expression of some form of life or consciousness. But the first thing I want to talk about is the definitions as well, starting on the must. Right? I'm kind of with you here. I'm kind of not. The main point of the must here is that it has to be certain, has to be very high probability. I believe that's the definition you gave yourself. If we say that there must be some form of life or consciousness after death, it has to be certainly held to be true. Now, you deform life as something in the biological sense, which is your definition, which is going to be important when we look at your first point. Because in your first point, you talk about stuff like paintings, like art, and that's not really life in the biological sense. We have to understand that if there has to be some form of life or consciousness after death, art and stuff like that doesn't qualify as biological life. But let's take a look at consciousness. So you bring in this idea of a collective stream of consciousness. I'm not really sure where you're going there. I'm going to interpret the resolution as saying that after death, after an individual or an individual being dies, that individual has to have some form of transcendent consciousness or some form of biological life that comes after that. And I'm not really buying the idea that a painting or something or art like that, it's not living and it doesn't have a mind of its own. It's not intuitively conscious. That's going to be important because even though stuff like art and stuff like writing and stuff like that, it's valuable and it might even express the original author or artist's thoughts, it's not a total representation of consciousness. It can never change. It can never think. It's not alive in a biological sense. But you also talk about the idea of children and stuff like that. So once more, the way we're going to be interpreting the resolution is we're going to say after death. For the thing that has died, is there an example of some form of life or consciousness? So when we look at ideas like children and other beings that exist, we have to remember that these aren't the same person. It's not the same individual. This person hasn't lived on, but their progeny has. To argue that children are an extension of your own life would be like saying that people that lived thousands of years ago are still alive today. In the traditional and biological sense, that just doesn't make sense. Remember, the people that are alive today, although they're the offspring, although they are the children of other individuals, they're certainly not the same life, and they definitely don't have the same consciousness. They think different things. They're biologically different. And if so far as we're keeping life as a biological definition by DNA, by all measurable concepts, these children aren't an example of in consciousness or in biological life of the parents or the people that came before them. That's not going to link together there. So a couple of important things to recap as we kind of run out of time here. So first of all, we have to remember that must means it has to be true. There has to be a really high probability. And secondly, when we talk about life or consciousness, it has to be biological life or consciousness that comes from an expansion of the original. It can't be something completely unrelated.
Okay. So sorry, I'm really, really rusty with my debate note-taking skills. It's been about 20 years. The first thing, so I offered you 3 possible examples. The first was one that you did not address, which is the idea of a person's bacterial colony, or in some circles, it's now being called the thanatobiome, so the biome that exists after death. And I actually read a super interesting article in The Guardian that was pretty recently that talked about how if you fly a drone over certain fields, the vegetation that grows and the soil and the composition of all of the organic biological living matter is actually different where something dead has been laid, as opposed to in other places where there isn't a more recent dead animal, for example, laying there. This was also studied with human cadavers, the microbiome of human people, which I assume that we're talking about human people, which you referenced quite a bit. So that's the first example. So in your own words, you said there must be some biological life that from the actual like dead thing, which I assume you mean like the human body, and that would be that, which you didn't address. So then my second point was the idea of a child, and you said it's not the same because it's not the same life. But if you define life as a biological process, my DNA is in my daughter and my DNA is in my son, and my living cells made their living cells. So it actually is the same, for example, tissues, the same living tissues that then go on to exist in them. It's true that it's not the same living tissues that presently exist in me, but my present living tissues are not the same as the living tissues that I had when I was 2 years old, like my daughter is either. So those living tissues change over time. So, and you said that would be ridiculous to think that that people that have lived in the past are not alive in the conventional sense. This asks about life or consciousness, and there are plenty of groups of people, myself included, who would very hardly disagree with you about that. So then the third one is I think that you confuse the idea of life versus the idea of consciousness. I'm not trying to argue that a painting is alive or that a musical recording is alive. I'm trying to say that those things are an expression of somebody's consciousness that can then be experienced later on after that person has died. Like, for example, this morning, if I was listening to Ziggy Stardust, that is me experiencing David Bowie's consciousness, even though David Bowie is no longer living. Also, you didn't define consciousness. So I'm going to kind of say that you agree maybe with my definition. And so you didn't define consciousness or even say anything, speak to it even really at all about the idea that the person experiencing the consciousness needs to be the person creating the thing. So you could have created it in the past. That's your consciousness. Somebody else can experience your consciousness then at a later date.
Okay, so a couple of things. So there are a couple of things that I didn't really agree with you there. So first of all, but over on top, right? Remember the interpretation I give to you in my last speech. I say the resolution means that after death, there has to be something that's some form of life or consciousness that is the original person's who has died, that is to somehow exist after. And secondly, the must means that we're having an almost 100% probability. So starting off with the first argument you make about how you have these like biological colonies. So you have to remember a couple of things. right? So first of all, like bacteria and stuff might live in me, they might live on me, but they are not me and they are not my life. That's going to be exceedingly important when you remember that a bunch of things are parasites, a bunch of things live off of other living things, but when the host dies, the parasite is no longer, it's not a representation of the original life. That's not a fair interpretation to have. And specifically, one of the main arguments you can make, you can turn it against yourself when you say that there are different biological colonies in areas where there are dead animals than where they are not. Meaning that obviously that in areas where there are alive animals, you have different biological colonies than those where there are dead animals. Remembering the fact that the bacteria extent and the bacteria present is different after the animal dies than when it's alive. That's going to be important. But secondly, let's look at the idea of consciousness. And this is what you shell for when you look at both the idea of children and the idea of art. Starting on art. You say you don't really respond to your interpretation how art is a measure of the consciousness of the original artist. That's not true. In fact, in the last speech, I talk about how stuff like art, stuff like music, it's no longer thinking, it's no longer feeling, it's no longer changing. There is no stream of consciousness, and it's no longer connected to the individual artist. Just because I wrote something a long time ago, it's not changing anymore. It's not thinking for itself. It's not conscious of its own. It may be a representation of what I once thought, but it's not changing anymore. But then on the idea of children, right? Once more, you don't respond to the interpretation or the idea that just because your children live, you're not alive anymore. In fact, I would argue it's absurd just because you say your DNA is in your children. Remember, your children are not an exact match to you in the first place. Their DNA is different from your DNA, even though your DNA gave rise to theirs. That's going to be important because, like I said, when you look at the idea of children, they are different biologically. They are not the same life form. Your children biologically are not you. That's intuitive. That makes sense. They don't have your DNA. But even from the idea of consciousness, your children still are not you. They don't think the exact same way. They're not the exact same person. They're not the exact same life form. That's going to be a continuing theme that we look at through this round. The idea of bacteria, the idea of children, they might have been supported by you. They might have originated from you, but they are not you. The same thing goes from art. And this is where you can tie the ideas of life and consciousness together. Regardless of if you're looking at life or if you're looking at consciousness, what this resolution and the interpretation I gave in my very first speech was that these things have to come directly and as a representation of the individual first being that died. And in all the forms that you've given, this simply is not true.
Okay, is it going? Okay, all right. So a few of the things that you said that I felt were not complete refutations of my argument. So first of all, I don't see what definition of consciousness you are giving, because a couple of things you said about consciousness is music is not consciousness because it's no longer changing. So it's not consciousness because it doesn't change. So you're positing perhaps that consciousness can only change. Or it's not consciousness because it does change. You said two different things. You said first about music is no longer changing, and then you also said it's not consciousness because the music doesn't change. That was like I think a direct quote. So if the music doesn't change, are you saying that consciousness does change or that it doesn't? I kind of want to know what your definition of that is. So that's first of all. Second of all, I want to take issue with your idea that the 100% probability or even close. The definition of must that you agreed to doesn't mean certainty. The dictionary definition that I gave says expressing an opinion about something that is logically very likely or something that should not be overlooked or missed. And so I think that it really shouldn't be overlooked or missed, this idea that forms of life and a form of life is your bacterial colony. So that's true that it's not your entire life, but it's a form of your life that can continue to survive you. And so when you give the example of that the dead animals, the vegetation around the dead animals is different from the vegetation that's around the live animals, that's rebutting an argument that I'm not making. I'm not trying to say that something that a cow whose heart is beating and lungs are breathing is the same as a cow that's dead. What I'm trying to say is that a cow that is dead still sustains these living processes, even though its heart is no longer breathing and its lungs are no longer, or its heart is no longer beating and its lungs are no longer breathing. So I think that further, you kind of tend to confuse the idea of life or consciousness. And so that's why it says or, it doesn't say and in the resolution. And so a form of life is living tissues, is a form of life. And so if I make a human being with my body, that's my living tissues continuing to live a form of life that I made with my own body. after I have died, presumably, right? A form of consciousness, that's why I give the example of art or something like that, is because that is continuing to live after the person has died. It doesn't have to be the person's entire consciousness, but it is a form of consciousness. And that's why the resolution is worded as such, right? So I'd like to know what your definition of consciousness is going forward. That would be very helpful.
Okay, so let's start off on a couple of important things. The first thing I want to talk about is the idea of these bacterial colonies, right? And it goes back to the interpretation I've given in my first speech and I've given my second speech, and I'm going to give it again now. It's the fundamental idea that the resolution means that after death, after an individual dies, some form of their own life or their own consciousness must continue to be extant. That's going to be important because I agree that bacterial colonies might live on you. They might live on you when you're alive. They might live on you when you're dead. But what you forget, what you have to remember is that something else sustained or being sustained off of your dead body is not your life. It has nothing to do with you specifically. As it could, these bacterial colonies could be on any individual. They're not your life. And the interpretation we've extended throughout this round is that after the individual dies, there has to be some sort of their own life or consciousness that continues, not just a parasite that lived on them for a long period of time. But the second is the idea of music or art. I think you're kind of confused what I'm saying here. All I say is that in order for something to be considered to have some form of consciousness, right, it has to have some sort of adaptability or an ability to think, the ability to change, the ability to continue forward. That's what I'm arguing here. At the point where the art is not changing, at the point where the art cannot think, at the point where the art might have been at one point what you had thought, it is no longer conscious in the present. The same goes for music. It's not changing, it's not thinking, it's not conscious. That's the definition we should be going for. And that kind of lines up with what you gave me in the first place. But secondly, on the idea of children, this is also going to be another point because you don't respond to what I say. I say that once more, the interpretation is that some form of your own life, your own consciousness has to go on. But your children, although they may have been made of you originally, they are not you. That doesn't make sense. Like I said, it doesn't make sense to say that the first human being ever is alive just because his descendants are alive today and they have some part of his DNA. That doesn't make sense. This death, this life after death, any form of it overall, it has to be you yourself. That's what we're looking at. That's the interpretation we should be weighing. At the point where your children are not you biologically, because like I said, their DNA is different. Their DNA is not yours. They are not you biologically. They are not you in life. And secondly, they are not you in consciousness. Counting both of the interpretations there, right? Because they don't think the exact same way that you do, right? On the idea of consciousness, like if we look back at the idea of art, if we look back at the idea of music, like I've stated time and again, right? They can't think, they can't change. That's no longer your own stream of consciousness that occurs after your death. It is what it is and it will never be changed. That's going to be really important overall. So looking at the definition of must going last, I think we're kind of on the same page here. I don't think it's going to be a very big deal in the round. We do agree that it has to be very, very likely, and we haven't really had any clash on probability yet, so we're pretty good there. But overall, remember the interpretation, some part of your own life has to continue, some part of your own consciousness has to continue to live, has to continue to think, and that's not happening in any of the points brought up by the affirmative.
Okay, so to address a couple of things you said, your main point that you repeated over and over again was this idea of it has to be your own life or your own consciousness, but the resolution doesn't say that. And so I think that you're maybe arguing against something that I'm not saying and something that the resolution isn't saying, because it doesn't say that your own consciousness or your own life has to continue. In fact, it even goes one step further and qualifies itself even more by saying some form. It doesn't even say life or consciousness. It says some form of life or some form of consciousness. So you're setting the bar kind of up here where it's like your life, and the resolution doesn't say that, nor am I saying that. So the best, from what I could gather, what you were saying is that what you think consciousness is the ability to think and change. And so this is why I wish we could kind of ask each other questions, because if that is indeed your definition of consciousness, is the ability to think and change, I think would mean that there's some underlying process or goal or organized process going forward, which is exactly what a bacterial colony would do, which is exactly what genes do as they seek to propagate themselves. So this idea that you said the first human is alive because his descendants, you would never say that the first alive because descendants are now alive. I think that in some sense you actually could say that the first human is still alive because his genes are still alive, or in some sense you could say that the first human is still alive because his descendants are now alive. And there are plenty of people and groups of people who do believe that in kind of a spiritual sense that that is definitely true, that someone is alive as long as their descendants are alive, as long as things they have interacted with are still alive. And in that sense, I want to put the past sentence that I just said, that alive in quotes, the kind of life, trying to further distinguish life from consciousness, because I'm using your words for alive. What I'm really actually meaning is consciousness, that someone's consciousness or someone's essence, someone's spirit, or perhaps their actual genetics have survived. This other thing that you said is bacterial colonies are not you, but I mean, I'm not a bacteriologist. I don't know if you are. But as much as I've been able to know about, if you're nodding your head, if you are, that'd be pretty funny. If you're, as far as I can tell, and really this is just my own like personal education and like being a mother and learning all about all the different things of like breastfeeding 2 children and knowing about how bacterial colonies are set up on infants. Is that your bacteria is indeed you. It impacts so many things in your life, and it's not like you could just transfer one person's bacterial colony to another person. So it is like an integral part of your actual being that does.
Okay, so a couple things, starting off right where you left off, right? I agree that bacterial colonies grow on you. I agree that bacterial colonies might be unique to you, but no way, shape, or form are they you. They are not your life. Their life is completely independent of yours. And the fact that you say that bacterial colonies continue to live after you die leads me to the conclusion to believe that these bacterial colonies aren't some fundamentally associated with your life because they live after you're dead. You two aren't intricately connected the way that you're describing them to be. But secondly, I want to get to a really important point that you make when you talk about the spiritual sense, right? This idea or this kind of spiritual religious belief that anything I make contact with will carry my spirit, will carry my consciousness on forward. This is going to be really important because the basis of spirituality and the basis of these religions is the idea of faith. That's going to be really important because faith requires belief even when there isn't 100% chance, right? At the point where you define must as very likely, right? Faith can't come into play because the idea of faith and the idea of must are directly contradictory to each other. They don't make sense because faith is belief in something that doesn't have to be true, but must says it has to be true. So we're not buying the spiritual argument there. But secondly, I'm interpreting the resolution in a way that says that after your death, there has to be some form of your life. That's my interpretation. If we want to read the resolution as written, we can argue a whole bunch of things. For example, I could argue that after death, after, say, for example, a great extinction event where everything on Earth is wiped out after there is death, there is literally no life or consciousness. There is no art, there is no music, there is no bacteria if the sun expands and engulfs us all. That is after death, and there doesn't have to be a form of life or consciousness. That's another argument you can look at in order to counteract the resolution there. But secondly, on the idea of children, which I talked about last speech, you didn't really get the chance to touch on it this speech. Remember, your children are not you biologically. I've said this time and again. They do not have your DNA to 100% match. Their DNA is biologically different than yours is. But secondly, on the idea of consciousness, remember, your children also don't think the way that you do. They don't act the way that you do. They are not your consciousness. But moving on down to art and music, remember, it's also not your consciousness in the current state. It can't think, it can't change, it can't adapt, it can't do any of those things. There is no stream of consciousness that's associated with these things. It's no longer any form of you. So the way I see it, there are 2 ways you can look at this resolution. One is under my interpretation, which I've extended throughout this round, where I say the resolution is implying, it wants to say that after you die, some form of you has to continue. And when I'm saying that's not true in a biological sense, it's not true about the bacteria, it's not true about the children or the art and the music. There's no stream of consciousness, there's no adaptability. But secondly, you can read the resolution exactly as written. And all that means now for me is I have to give you a scenario in which after death, there is no chance of life and no chance of consciousness, because that would counteract the must. And I give you the extinction scenario. After we go extinct, after there's an extinction event, after the sun expands and kills us all, there is literally no life, there is no consciousness, none of the things you describe exist, and that is.
Okay, so I'm going to address the last thing you said first about the extinction event. So this actually kind of goes to my larger, I guess, unifying point, is that after an extinction event, perhaps the entire Earth would not be alive. And what I'm trying to say is that humans are merely one piece of this collective consciousness that exists on the earth. So if the earth were completely gone, then of course there would be no consciousness that we all share like on the earth, right? So there's that. Okay, so then this other idea about the faith and the religion, I'm not making a faith-based or a religious-based argument. You just said a couple of things like most people would think that was ridiculous, that saying because the first man lived and now his descendants have his DNA, that man is in some sense still living. Well, I don't think that that's ridiculous, because I actually have heard people say very similar things to that. And I think that if you want to reference that being ridiculous, there are plenty of people who who would not think that that is ridiculous and think that that's a valid way of interacting with the world, right? Okay, so then there's this idea of a human has to be, or a person has to be alive and thinking, and consciousness has to be something where it is changing, and you're not conscious unless you are able to think or change. So if that is your definition of consciousness, that something that is conscious has to be able to think and change, and I see you nodding there, that something that is conscious has to be able to think and change. How is a biological process not thinking and changing? Like, how is a process where several different entities, several different organisms interact with each other not able to think and change? And so that's first of all. Your children do have your DNA, which I know you're saying your children are not you. I think what this really comes down to, like the main differentiating point, is this idea that you are trying to say that your entire consciousness or your entire life needs to survive you after death. And what the resolution says is some form of life or some form of consciousness would survive you after death. And so finally, see if I can find it. Sorry, I can't. I had a really, really good quote that I wanted to read about consciousness being something that's interactive as you interact with something. And so the resolution doesn't say your consciousness. The resolution doesn't say your own personal consciousness. It can be a consciousness that other people interact with, consciousness that you've left behind, or life that you've left behind. Okay.
Okay, there are two possible scenarios. There are two possible interpretations. The first is my interpretation of the resolution. I agree it's not exactly the way the resolution is written. I thought it was intuitive based on what the resolution said and what its meaning has implied when we've debated so far in the round. My interpretation that it has to be some form of your life or your consciousness. But you don't have to buy my interpretation in order to vote for me in this round. You can just buy me on the actual written text, right? So going back to the idea of consciousness, you kind of concede my definition in the last speech. You say you agree that it has to think, it has to change, but you say these microorganisms are thinking, they're changing, they're growing on you. So first of all, remember, the argument was made in response to the idea of art and music. At the point where you concede that consciousness has to have thinking and has to change, you agree that art and music aren't valid examples of forms of consciousness, nor valid examples of forms in life. So that point is gone. But on the idea of these microorganisms, remember, I agree that these bacteria are changing, they're multiplying, they're replicating, but you are not thinking, you are not changing. That's going to be really important, because the original life that died after death, it isn't thinking, it isn't changing anymore. But this brings us to the idea of, does life that happens after the original life count as the original life? And you make this argument that many people find that after death, all the things that you've encountered, all the people you've interacted with, they still count as part of your life, as part of your spirit. This goes back to the idea of faith. This goes back to the idea of spirituality and religion. They're all intricately tied. The reason for this is because they're all based on faith. You can't know for sure that after you die, these people will continue to do X, Y, or Z things, because you can't know anything after you die. You believe that that is true. It is based on faith. But the resolution, what we both agreed on, it has the word must in it, which indicates a very high likely chance. That's completely contradictory to the idea of faith in its base form, because faith is the idea that regardless of what the chance is, you believe in something because you believe in it. Must and a very high likely probability counteracts the idea of faith on a face level. But lastly, and most importantly, is this extinction scenario that I talked about, because it fits the resolution by text exactly. It's going to be a great reason to vote neg in today's round. After an extinction event, there is death. After death, there is literally no life or consciousness anymore. every single one of the things you talked about, all the children, all the art, all the microorganisms, they are all gone. Death has happened. After this death, there is no form of life or consciousness. This is going to be really important because in order to negate, all I have to do is prove that after death, there must not be a form of life or consciousness, right? If I prove that it isn't a must, if I prove that it doesn't have to happen, then you're going to be voting for me, and we're voting off of the extinction scenario, right? Because eventually there's 100% chance that we will have an extinction scenario. That is a guaranteed probability because the sun will eventually expand, collapse, and kill us all. That's a 100% chance. And after that death, there will not be life or consciousness. The affirmative agrees to that. If there's no life or consciousness, we negate.
Okay, so last thing, I tried to lump, I'm not going to really have enough time to get to this. Art and music is conscious